Welcome to another History Wanderer video. In this video I'm going to be flying a Hawker Hurricane in IL-2 1946 in the first mission of the Japanese Singapore invasion scenario. Now, before I start to talk about the Battle of Britain, I would first like to mention a unique aircraft which also was used by the RAF in this period. This aircraft is the Boulton-Paul Defiant. The plane itself was very similar in looks to the Hawker Hurricane, but was of a totally different design. The major thing being, although it was a single-engined fighter, it was a two-man crew, which was comprised of a pilot with no weaponry and a powered turret with 4 Browning .303 guns. The purpose of this aircraft was solely bomber interception. Whence Fighter Command realised that their main adversary in another major conflict would be Germany, they quickly realised that a standard fighter aircraft couldn't reach from Germany to Britain. So they theorised that all the RAF would have to intercept at that period for home defence would be bombers. So what they needed was a fighter aircraft that could quickly get to the altitude of the bombers and then sit in the formation of the bombers and, using the turrets, target individual bombers and shoot them down. It was a novel theory, and one, if the Luftwaffe had have come over having to fly over France, would probably have been very successful aircraft, because the utility of the turret meant the plane would be able to find the blind spot from the German gunners and sit in that blind spot and just keep pumping away until either the bomber crew lost confidence, ditched bombs, headed for home, or they were successful in bringing the bomber down. As it was, the Battle of France didn't take that long, and the RAF found themselves facing not only the bombers as they expected, but also the fighters in both the Me-109 and the Me-110, both which managed to totally outclass the Defiant. The end result was the Defiant was decimated and was withdrawn from frontline service. But if France hadn't have fallen, the Defiant would have been within range of attacking the German bombers, but the Me-109s and the Me-110s would not have been able to escort the bombers all the way to Britain and back from the bases in Germany. So, as far as the Defiant goes, nice idea, nearly worked but not quite. Right, now on to the two main aircraft used by the RAF, the Hawker Hurricane and the Spitfire. And this is basically which of the two was the better. Not just in speed, climb, manoeuvrability, but also in the important things like turnaround on the ground, since from one sortie to the next sortie, and also the speed of damage repair. Right, so I'll start off by quickly going into how the two aircraft came about. Now, it's well known that the Supermarine Spitfire was a development of the Schneider float planes, of which won the Schneider Trophy outright by winning it 3 times in succession. Their chief designer, Reginald Mitchell, when he heard of the Germans developing the Me-109, he took it upon himself. It wasn't a government scheme that made him do it, he heard the 109 and he knew that Britain lagged far behind with the Gloucester Gladiator that had just come into service. So he took it upon himself to design the Supermarine Spitfire, of which he looked at the Schneider planes he designed and he started to modify them in such a way that he could put a fully enclosed cockpit on. At first it was only envisaged to use four machine guns until Hugh Dowding did a test and realised that a fighter would only have a target in its sights for a couple of seconds, and that in them few seconds it was there, 4 machine guns wasn't enough to bring it down. So they then requested 8 guns to match what Dowding were requesting. Now in the meantime, the government had finally got into gear and put out specifications for a new mono-wing fighter aircraft that must have a speed of over 300 miles an hour with a fully enclosed cockpit. Mitchell's first design was somewhere halfway between a Spitfire and the Schneider float plane. It had fixed undercarriage and spats on, so the undercarriage looked something similar to the Stuka's undercarriage. And with a Kestrel engine that was fitted to it, its performance wasn't as high as expected. So Mitchell started to look at a replacement he could come up with. And then he heard that Rolls-Royce had just developed the Merlin engine, which gave over 1,000 brake horsepower. So he totally redesigned the aircraft around this engine. He also opted for the elliptical wing, not the standard rectangular wing, because his wind test tunnel showed that it was very efficient, not only at manoeuvring but also at ease of control for the pilot, because the airflow over the wing was so long that gave it a level of response to the controls that other aircraft at the time just didn't have. They give plenty of notification through the controls through juddering to let the pilot know if he was approaching a stall, and it also meant that the pilot, with ease of moving the stick, could manoeuvre the aircraft even at low speeds, which the 109, even though it could turn as sharply as the Spitfire, it was harder on the control column, so only the real confident German pilots would push the 109 to that limit, which gave the Supermarine Spitfire a massive advantage in a dogfight. The downside of it was because it was a new design and it was an all-metal aircraft, they needed a brand new factory, brand new tools, and to make one Spitfire cost an absolute fortune. It cost that much that RAF officers of the day saw it only as a type of toy, and they said it'll never go into production because it cost too much and it'll take too long to build them. Now, on the other side, we have Sir Sidney Cam and the Hawker Company. Now, Hawker had been making planes first as the Sopwith Aviation Company since 1916, and it's made a successful development of aircraft all the way through the First World War, resulting in the Sopwith 1.5 strutter, the Sopwith Pup, and more importantly the Sopwith Camel. And these were the backbone of the Royal Flying Corps during the First World War. After the First World War, Sopwith tried to make ends meet by making motorcycles. Unfortunately, this venture failed and Sopwith Aviation went into administration. So Sopwith restarted the business using one of his test pilots' names, Hawker, to start another company, and this company pursued pre-war aircraft design in a series of biplanes all the way up to 1939. The design of light bombers was so effective and so fast that they could outrun any fighter of the day when they first saw service. When Sidney Cam saw the specifications for the new fighter, he looked at his current fighter, which was in RAF service, which was the Hawker Fury. So the first thing he did, he redesigned it in such a way as he took the top wing off, redesigned and lengthened and strengthened the lower wing, fitted an enclosed canopy and retractable undercarriage. No, it wasn't of all metal design. The early Hurricanes were fabric through and through, apart from the engine cowling, which of course housed the Merling, which Sidney Cam aimed for from start to finish with his new design. But because of this, the Hawker factories were already in a position to manufacture the aircraft, so they'd be cheaper to make, and they could get them off the production line a lot faster than they could with a Spitfire. So it comes to show that actually in the manufacture of the aircraft, in this instance, the Hawker Hurricane was the more important of the two. When war was declared by Britain on Germany in September 1939, the only real strength of fighter aircraft they had at the time was the Hurricane. They had Spitfires coming online and coming into squadron strength, but they didn't have the numbers. So what they decided was to pick one type of aircraft, as it would be easier to supply abroad. And for obvious reasons, for numbers, ease of production, they sent the Hurricane to France. Now, the Hurricane, for all the failings of tactics of the days, performed very well. Its kill to loss ratio was a lot higher than was expected. The only thing that held it back was the poor tactics that the RAF used of the day. They flew in a rigid 3 Vic formation, which was the leader at the front and 2 wingmen on either side in tight formation. The idea of this was similar to the Bullpole Defiant, was to get on the tail of the bomber and all 3 aircraft open fire as they closed. The harmonisation of the guns was at 450 yards ahead of the aircraft. The theory being is the pilot put the bomber in the sights, opened fire and kept firing as he closed in the bomber. So the 3 planes together and their firepower would be sufficient to bring the bomber down. But obviously during the Battle of France, every bomber was escorted by at least one Me-109. And the 3 Vic formation meant that only the leader was looking for possible dangers and targets. The 2 wingmen was focused solely on keeping station on the leader. This inflexible formation caused heavy losses to the RAF during the Battle of France. Another thing they did, they flew combat patrols. They didn't fly escorts for the British main striking force of the Blenheims as it's known, even though there is no village of Blenheim. The village where the famous battle fought was Blenheim, but the Blenheims and the Fairy Battles. These planes, although they outperformed the German bombers, were sent out without escorts. As a result, the Me-109s found them sitting ducks and slaughtered them on the daylight raids. If they had have gone out with a Hurricane escort, things might have been a bit different, but the RAF at that time was still on the mindset of bomber command for attacking, fighter command for defence, and it's something they carried through the Battle of France. If they had have escorted the bombers, things may have been different because they may have tied up the 109s while the bombers got on with the job. But anyway, it was down to the tactical problems between Bomber Command and Fighter Command, which meant even right up to the late stage of the wars, they still acted independently. Now, the Spitfire was kept in Britain, and they were still struggling to produce the numbers to bring them up to sufficient strength. And the pilots were still getting training and adapting to the new machines, which, although an excellent design, was totally different and radical from the aircraft they were used to flying. Whereas the Hurricane was a midway gap between the ultramodern and the old, so the pilots could adapt to them quickly, all apart from the retractable undercarriage. The Spitfire was an entire new machine, and it needed an entire new mentality to fly, and that took time to bring the pilots up to speed. So for that reason, it was decided to keep them at home to build up the squadron strength, because of the time it took to actually manufacture the aircraft was a big hindrance when it come to putting it into the field and first seeing action. After the fall of France, the Germans started to attack the British convoys in the English Channel. This was the precursor to what has now become known as the Battle of Britain. But at this point, we have to take stock of the air strength of Fighter Command at the time. Now, they had 38 operational Hurricanes squadrons and 18 squadrons of Spitfires, of which again it shows that the manufacture speed of the Spitfire was that low that even though it hadn't seen any action and hadn't taken any combat losses apart from a few over Dunkirk, they'd still only managed to furnish 18 squadrons. Where the Hurricane, which had seen action and losses in France, Belgium, and also in Norway, where the full Norwegian contingency was lost when the aircraft carrier bringing them back after the failed attempt to stop the Germans taking Norway was sunk. They were still able to have 38 operational squadrons. The common thing that people say is that the Spitfire could outturn any aircraft in the sky, where this wasn't true. The Spitfire couldn't even outturn the Hawker Hurricane. The Spitfire had a faster roll rate, but the Hurricane would turn inside a Spitfire every time, and that was simply to give it an edge when it come to the 109. If they saw a 109 diving down on them, the pilot would just simply hit sharp port or starboard turn, and the 109 won't be able to keep with him, and normally the 109 would carry on diving and fall through. If of course the pilot didn't see the attacking aircraft, then the end result was normally catastrophic, as the Germans didn't get into a turn fight. The main German mentality was to get the fighters up high to look at the formation, see who's coming to attack the bombers, and diving down on them before they had a chance to get to the bombers. And it was a very effective tactic that the RAF found difficult until they got aircraft with the equal to rate of climb, of which the later marked Spitfires managed to do. But early doors, the climb rate of the RAF fighters was mediocre on the Hurricane and good in the Spitfire, but the 109 held the aces when it came to altitude fighting. But luckily the Battle of Britain was fought in altitudes of round about 19,000 feet and below, the majority of the time being between about 14,000 feet or slightly below, which meant that the Hurricanes and Spitfires didn't have to climb as much as the Germans did to intervene against the B-17s, who were flying a lot higher up. Otherwise it would have taken them a lot longer to intercept the bombers, but the bombers wouldn't have been as accurate. Now, another thing about the Spitfire is the pilot's head. When he's looking out to the front of the aircraft, he's looking down the nose of the engine cowling, which is straight. So what it means is he has like 100-degree horizon in front of him, and he can only see above that. He can't see below. That's the reason why the Spitfire had to zigzag down the runway to get position to take off, because the visibility from the Spitfire wasn't very good at all, because he had literally 180-degree view restriction. The Hawker Hurricane, on the other way, the pilot was on a raised cockpit, and the engine cowling sloped down to the propeller hub, which meant that he was able to look at a target below his gun sight, so he could bring the target to bear into the gun sight easier, where a Spitfire pilot would have to try to roll his aircraft to see the target to bring it on to gun sight, then maybe wings level. He couldn't rely on what was below his spinner because he couldn't see the target. He was obscured by the engine. This is something which Hurricane pilots used over and over again when it came to attacking bombers. Another thing which seems minor, but really is a major thing before a plane goes into action, is the Hurricane's undercarriage was broad and rugged, and they folded inward into the wings. So what it meant was, when the undercarriage was down and the plane was grounded, the weight was more evenly spread and it was stable on the ground, which meant rough airfields were fine for operations, whereas the Spitfire, like the ME-109, had narrow tracked undercarriage, and because the wheels were so close together and practically just past the fuselage, it was very unstable on the ground. So any bumps on the aerodrome or any divots, the aircraft could pitch and yaw and literally fall off its wheels, either nose up or just go onto its wingtip, making the aircraft unserviceable. Whereas the Hurricane, with its broader wheel span, was more rugged when it came to uneven grounds, particularly during the Battle of Britain, when they started to use rougher airstrips when the main aerodromes were being bombed by the Germans. Another thing which may seem minor but was also to have a major effect was the radiator placement on both aircraft. The Spitfire's one radiator in the Mark I was on the wing, and it was behind the undercarriage. So it meant that when the plane was started, the engine was first started, the engine started to overheat because the plane had to get airborne and the wheels retracted to get the temperature of the engine down and let the radiator get to work fully. This meant that once a scramble had been made, the pilots had to run to the aircraft, get into the aircraft and start the engine then. And then they had to quickly taxi to take off position and get into the air quickly, otherwise the engine would overheat and ruin. The Hawker Hurricane's radiator was centrally placed in the centre lower of the fuselage. It was in such a place, and it was a large radiator, that as soon as the scramble was sounded, the ground crew could start the engine. So when the pilot reached the plane, all he had to do was strap in and get instructions from the tower of when to go. Now, unlike the Spitfire, if the vector control wanted them to wait, they could. They could sit on the ground longer because the radiators were functional and the engines didn't overheat. So that gave sector control a bit more time to work out in some scenarios whether they need to scramble them or stand them down. This was another huge advantage the RAF found in the Hurricane, is that they could have them on standby, engines ticking over, ready to go at a moment's notice. Where the Spitfire squadrons, as soon as they gave them notice to scramble, they had to go there and then. They had to get airborne. They couldn't sit on the ground, otherwise their engine would have overheated. Once they had successfully scrambled and reached the altitude of the bombers, I say the bombers, during the Battle of Britain they was always vectored to the height of the bombers, and the RAF pilots usually found themselves coming in either just below the bombers or at the same altitude of them. It was only later, when the squadron commanders started adding a couple of thousand feet above the bomber stream, to give them a chance to dive down onto the bombers, which gave them a faster rate of attack and made them less vulnerable to return fire. But on the topic of return fire, because the Spitfire was all metal of construction, hits from the German machine guns, and particularly the cannons, was catastrophic. A couple of hits from a 20mm cannon, and if the Spitfire managed to return to base, he would have to see his plane be sent back to the depot if the damage was on the fuselage, because it could only be repaired in the shop. It couldn't be repaired at the aerodrome, meaning that the aircraft was off strength at that point. The Hawker Hurricane, being majority canvas, although during the Battle of Britain a lot of the Hurricanes had metal wings which added performance, if a cannon round hit the fuselage of a Hurricane, the canvas was so weak and the round went through so quick that it didn't actually detonate the high explosive warhead on the German cannon. So in effect, the majority of the times they just made holes in the canvas. So when the planes landed, the riggers found it so easy to just patch up the damage, and on some occasions they actually managed to patch up the damage and get the Hurricane back up in the air without having time to paint over the camouflage scheme of the patches. So they'd be going up with different coloured patches which were visible, so the damage to other pilots could see where the plane had been hit beforehand as they were flying in formation back onto active service. But it meant an excellent turnaround for the Hurricane. They had to take real bad damage before it was sent to the sector workshops to get the aircraft back up operational. Now, when they contacted the opposition, the Hurricane also held the advantage in the way its guns were grouped. The Hurricane has a thick leading edge, and its 8 machine guns are grouped into 2 fours. What this means is that firepower was very concentrated. So once they started to harmonise between 250 to 150 yards, the cone of fire of those 8 machine guns was very tight. So they particularly went where the harmonisation was, and it gave a deadly concentration of fire at that range. So once the pilot had selected his target, got his reflector gun sight set for 150 yards for the type of aircraft he identified, he knew that it wasn't as effective as a cannon round. And when he hit the rounds, when the rounds started to go into the opposition, and he knew they were going to do damage if his aim was good, the wings filled the reflector gun sight. He knew if his rounds hit, he was going to cause catastrophic damage. The Spitfire's guns were on the full length of the wing, which meant it was harder to harmonise the guns. This meant that it was more like a 12-bore shotgun than an accurate weapon, because the cone of the firepower was broader. Now, in a dogfight engagement against a fighter aircraft, it doesn't take as much damage to take one down, but a bomber, you've got to be able to put all your rounds where you need them. With a Spitfire, a lot of the rounds missed. Now, as I say, against a fighter, it only took fewer rounds to bring one down, so in a dogfight it was a bit of a plus, but again, attacking the bombers, it was a big negative, because the majority of the rounds missed the target, because simply the weapons were spread too far along the wing of the aircraft. The Hurricane also, with its thicker leading edge, was a steadier gun platform. So when the gun button was pressed, it was easier for the pilot to remain on target, where the Spitfire juddered. And so the pilot had to fight to keep the target in the sights as he engaged it. Now the Hurricane, with its broader wing, was the first to be upgraded with 4 20mm cannons. They did experiment with 20mm cannons in both the Hurricane and the Spitfire during the Battle of Britain, but they found the weapon was unreliable, so it was never used at squadron strength. There was only 1 or 2 aircraft of both types which were tried, and both types were withdrawn from active service. Now the Hurricane could easily accommodate 4 20mm cannon, 2 on each wing, close together, similar to the 4 Browning ordnance on each wing. Whereas the Spitfire at first, with a Mark V, they could only accommodate 2 20mm cannons, 1 in each wing. So to increase the firepower, they added another 4 Browning machine guns, of which one side it gave an advantage to a Spitfire is they could use the Brownings to range onto a target, and then the cannons, once the Brownings round started to hit, they could use it as a more accurate weapon. But the Hurricane could engage with 4 20mm cannon and cause catastrophic damage to any target it engaged. Now, this brings us to the development of the 2 aircraft. The Spitfire's development was worked all the way up to the Mark 21 and was still in active service right up to the 1950s. The last type seen in action during the Israeli war with the Egyptians in the 1950s. The ironic thing that the last aircraft a Spitfire shot down was another Spitfire. During an engagement, an Israeli Spitfire engaged and shot down an Egyptian Spitfire. So the weird thing about the type was the last aircraft to be shot down by that type was the same type. But because Mitchell died before the Spitfire went into service, Supermarine focused on adapting the type to make it better and better and better. till they got to what they saw was the pinnacle of the type, as I say, which was the Mark 20s, and by that time they'd reached the limit of the airframe capacity and engine power, as the jet engines were starting to make themselves more and more present in the air, in the skies. On the other hand, Sidney Cam and his team made a few modifications to the Hurricane, but nothing major. Bigger engines with the Merlins, as the bigger Merlins came online, increased the firepower, but they never really settled down to develop the aircraft. The reason being is that coming back from the Sopwith days up to the Hawker days, they made a type and then they looked at how they could improve the type with a new type. They looked at the Hurricane, they saw what was good with it, understood what was bad with it, so they shopped around, and then they started to design new aircraft types like the Hawker Typhoon and the Hawker Tempest. This was understanding where the Hurricane was good and understanding where the Hurricane was weak, so they designed new aircraft to fill both categories. And that was a major difference between Hawker Aviation and Supermarine. Hawker were always looking at improvements in such a way of bringing out a new type. And this mentality, especially under Sidney Cam, followed all the way through to the 1960s, when they designed and built the superb Hawker Harrier, an aircraft that is still in service today and is still a unique type of aircraft. But it's simply down to Hawker understanding that if you stick with one type, sooner or later it gets old and past its time. Whereas what they've always done was look at the type which is the best of the day, and then as technology moves on, they looked at ways to improve the designs, and rather than try to develop one type to fit that new standard, they were willing to look at new designs or come up with new types of aircraft suitable. So even on the way through from the Typhoon and the Tempest, you've even got aircraft like the Hawker Hunter, which was an exceptional dogfighter of its time, to come through to the Hawker Harrier. But if you look at each type of Hawker aircraft, you will see the step and the slight improvements at every type when another type surpassed it. Whereas with Supermarine, it was the Spitfire, that was it, and they developed it as far as they could, and that was the end. Whereas Hawker, of course, became Hawker Siddeley Aviation, which is now part of the British Aerospace Engineering Group and is still producing planes to this day. The most common one, of course, is the Typhoon, the Eurofighter, which is currently in active service with the Royal Air Force. So although the Spitfire may have the glory during the Battle of Britain, Hawker produced aircraft from the beginning of the First World War all the way through to modern days, and they've always stayed at the forefront of technology and pushed their aircraft design as far as possible. So, to sum up for the question that was asked at the beginning of the video, if there was only one type available to the Royal Air Force during the start of the Battle of Britain, could Britain have survived the Battle of Britain with just one type? If they relied on the Spitfire, the RAF could never put the numbers up to defeat the Luftwaffe. 18 squadrons was nowhere near sufficient numbers to beat the Germans. Even though it was faster than the Hurricane, better rate of climb, almost 20 miles an hour faster in level flight, there just wasn't enough on strength to defeat the Germans. Now, if the RAF only had Hurricanes, they could have continued to bring them off the production line at a faster rate. So, even though at the start of the battle they had 38 operational squadrons, the factories would have outstripped those losses, and the pilots' numbers would have gained strength. Where we'd have lost more pilots and aircraft, and the battle probably would have gone on longer, the result would have been the same. Britain would still have been able to defeat the Luftwaffe using just the Hurricane. The 109s attacking it would have to, sooner or later, to cause maximum damage to more squadrons of Hurricanes coming online, will have to have tried to dogfight with the Hurricane, and the Hurricane would have held the edge in that engagement. But primarily, the Hurricane was simply there as the boom pole Defiant, as a dedicated bomber killer. And that was what the Hurricane excelled at, which is why it saw service all over the world with the Royal Air Force and the other air forces of the Commonwealth, and even as you see in this scenario with IL-2, it's the main combat type for Singapore. The Spitfire didn't have enough numbers to send out, and the Hurricane saw service, even though it was an outdated type, all the way through to the end of the war, even being used to carry two 40mm cannon as can openers as anti-tank weapons, and they were very effective, although the performance of the Hurricane itself with the extra weight was totally unmanoeuvrable, and any fighter with his salt would have found him a sitting target. But the fact is, the Hurricane was able to be used in this capacity, where the Spitfire, it was very susceptible to ground fire, and many losses of the type was to ground fire, which is simply down to its narrow wings, of which any damage to the wing could be catastrophic, especially to the quad German flak at low altitudes. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please click that subscribe button and ring that little bell and look for any videos I do next. And I hope you found it an interesting video. If you have any comments, please list them below. And for now, thanks for watching and enjoy the rest of your day.